The unmarked sedan rolled to a stop outside a quiet suburban home in Knoxville, Tennessee, its engine ticking in the early morning silence of March 2024. Detective Rachel Torres sat behind the wheel for a moment, her hands gripping tight, staring at the modest brick house with its neat lawn and American flag hanging limply in the still air. 8 years. 8 years this person had lived here, waved to neighbors, mowed grass, existed in plain sight while Louise and Jay Guy lay in the ground and their family waited for answers that seemed like they would never come. Torres took a breath, nodded to her partner, and stepped out into the cool spring morning. The arrest warrant in her jacket pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. This was the day that would shatter everything this community thought they knew about the people living among them. Before we continue this story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Cases like this take months of research and investigation to bring you, and your support helps us tell the stories that deserve to be told. The call had come in on a Sunday afternoon in November of 2016. The kind of late autumn day when Tennessee skies turn gray and heavy with the promise of rain that never quite arrives. A neighbor had noticed that Louise and Jay Guy's newspapers were piling up on their front porch, 3 days' worth of unread news yellowing in the weather. That wasn't like them. Louise was meticulous about bringing in the paper each morning with her coffee, settling into the floral armchair by the window to read while Jay made breakfast. They were creatures of habit. The Guys, the kind of couple whose routines you could set your watch by. So when those papers started stacking up, when the lights stayed off past their usual evening hours, when nobody answered the doorbell or the increasingly worried phone calls, the neighbor knew something was terribly wrong. She called the police, her voice shaking as she explained that Louise and Jay would never just leave, never go anywhere without telling someone, and please, could someone check on them, because the feeling in her gut was screaming that something bad had happened. The officers who responded found the front door locked, curtains drawn, everything appearing normal from the outside, but normal was a lie. When they made entry into the small ranch-style home on Maple Ridge Drive, they found a scene that would haunt everyone who saw it. Louise Guy, 72 years old, and her husband Jay, 74, were dead. The violence that had been visited upon them in their own home, the place where they should have been safest, was the kind that makes even experienced homicide detectives go quiet. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This wasn't a random break-in. This was personal, deliberate, and filled with a rage that felt almost incomprehensible when you understood who these victims were. Louise and Jay Guy were not the kind of people you would ever imagine as murder victims. They were quiet, kind, utterly unremarkable in the most beautiful way. Louise had worked for 35 years as a school secretary at Knoxville Elementary, the kind of woman who remembered every child's name, who kept Band-Aids and kind words in her desk drawer, who made birthdays special with handwritten cards and always knew which kids needed a little extra attention. Teachers loved her because she kept everything running smoothly. Parents loved her because she treated their children like they mattered. Kids loved her because she had a way of making you feel seen, even when you were just passing through the office to drop off a forgotten lunch. When she retired in 2010, the school threw her a party that filled the gymnasium, and the principal said that Louise Guy was the heart of that building, the person who made it feel like home. Jay had spent his career as a mechanic, running a small independent shop on the east side of town where he built a reputation for honest work and fair prices. He was the guy you went to when you needed your car fixed and couldn't afford the dealership rates, the mechanic who would explain what was wrong in terms you could understand and never tried to sell you repairs you didn't need. He had rough hands and a gentle manner, the kind of man who spoke slowly and meant what he said. He loved old westerns and college football, kept his tiny shop organized like a military operation, and had a soft spot for stray cats that would wander into his garage looking for warmth. He'd feed them, let them sleep in the corner, give them names like Carburetor and Sparkplug. When he closed the shop in 2012, his regular customers felt like they'd lost a friend. The Guys had been married for 48 years, one of those couples who had grown into each other over the decades until they moved as a single unit. They finished each other's sentences. They had the same coffee order. They held hands when they walked through the grocery store, even after all those years, even when Louise's arthritis made her grip weak and Jay's back wasn't what it used to be. Their home on Maple Ridge Drive was modest, a small 3-bedroom ranch they'd bought in 1985 and slowly made their own. with careful renovations and a garden that Louise tended with the same attention she'd given to the elementary school kids. Tomatoes in the summer, mums in the fall, bird feeders that attracted cardinals and blue jays that Jay loved to watch from the kitchen window. They had 2 children, both grown and living out of state. Their daughter Sarah lived in Colorado with her husband and 3 kids, working as a nurse and calling her parents every Sunday evening without fail. Their son Michael had moved to Florida years ago, worked in hotel management, visited twice a year for Christmas and his parents' anniversary. The guys had 5 grandchildren who adored them, kids who spent summer weeks in Tennessee running through sprinklers and learning how to make Louise's famous peach cobbler and listening to Jay's stories about the old days when you could fix a car with nothing but a wrench and some know-how. They were supposed to have more years. They were supposed to see those grandkids graduate, get married, have children of their own. They were supposed to grow older together in that little house with the bird feeders and the tomato plants, dying peacefully in their sleep at 90-something, surrounded by family and memories of a life well lived. Instead, someone had stolen all of that. Someone had come into their home on a day that should have been ordinary and taken everything from them, from their children, from their grandchildren, from the community that loved them. The Knoxville Police Department mobilized immediately, treating this as what it clearly was, a double homicide that demanded every resource they could throw at it. The house became a crime scene, sealed off with yellow tape while forensic teams spent days processing every inch of the property. Photographs were taken from every angle. Evidence was collected, cataloged, and sent to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation labs for analysis. Neighbors were interviewed, asked if they'd seen anything unusual, any strange vehicles, any unfamiliar people in the area around the time Louise and Jay were last seen alive. The timeline was established through painstaking detective work. Louise and Jay had been seen by a neighbor on Thursday evening, November 10th, bringing in groceries from their car around 6 in the evening. They'd waved, exchanged pleasantries about the weather turning cold, mentioned they were making chili for dinner. That was the last confirmed sighting. By Sunday afternoon, when the concerned neighbor called police, they'd been dead for days. The medical examiner would later estimate between 48 and 72 hours based on the state of decomposition and other factors too clinical to dwell on. That meant they died sometime between Thursday night and early Saturday morning, killed in their own home during a window when most of their neighbors were going about their normal lives, watching television, sleeping, completely unaware that something horrific was happening just houses away. The question that haunted investigators from day one was simple and impossible. Who would want to kill Louise and Jay Guy? They had no enemies that anyone could identify. They didn't owe money. They weren't involved in anything criminal or even vaguely shady. They were retired, living on Social Security and Jay's pension from the mechanics union, comfortable but not wealthy. There was no obvious motive, no clear suspect, nothing that made immediate sense. The house hadn't been ransacked. Louise's purse was still on the kitchen counter with cash in her wallet. Jay's coin collection, worth several $1,000s and kept in a display case in the living room, was untouched. If this was a robbery, the perpetrator had taken nothing of value, which meant this was about something else entirely. Detective Marcus Holland caught the case, a 23-year veteran of the Knoxville Police Department who had worked more homicides than he cared to count. He stood in the guy's living room that first day, looking at the pictures on the walls, wedding photos and baby pictures and grandkids' school portraits, trying to understand what had happened here. Trying to imagine what kind of person could do this to 2 elderly people who had spent their lives being kind. Holland had seen a lot of darkness in his career, but something about this case got under his skin in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Maybe it was the senselessness of it. Maybe it was the fact that his own parents were about the same age as the victims, and he couldn't stop thinking about how easily this could have been their story. Whatever the reason, Holland made a promise standing in that living room he would find who did this. However long it took, whatever it required, he would get justice for Louise and Jay Guy. The investigation moved forward with the urgency that double homicides demand. Forensic evidence was processed. DNA samples were collected from the scene. Fingerprints were lifted and run through every database available. The guys' phone records were pulled, showing nothing unusual, just calls to their kids, to a few friends, to the pharmacy and the grocery store. Their bank accounts revealed no strange transactions, no large withdrawals, no signs of financial distress or blackmail. Their computers, an old desktop they mainly used for email and looking at pictures of the grandkids, showed no threatening messages. No suspicious communications, nothing that pointed toward a motive or a suspect. Investigators interviewed everyone in the guy's orbit. Their children were immediately cleared, both having solid alibis with multiple witnesses placing them in Colorado and Florida during the relevant time frame. Friends from church described Louise and Jay as beloved members of their congregation, never missed a Sunday service, always brought casseroles to potlucks, helped with the food pantry, the kind of people who made a community stronger just by being part of it. Former co-workers from the elementary school and the mechanic shop all said the same thing. The guys were good people, genuinely good, the kind who didn't have a mean bone in their bodies. Nobody could imagine who would want to hurt them. The neighborhood canvass revealed little. A few people remembered seeing an unfamiliar car parked on the street that Thursday evening, but descriptions were vague and conflicting. Dark-colored, maybe a sedan, maybe an SUV, gone by Friday morning, no license plate, no distinctive features, nothing that could be traced. One neighbor thought they'd heard raised voices coming from the guy's house late Thursday night, but couldn't be certain. Might have been a television, might have been from a different house entirely. The leads that seemed promising in those first days gradually dissolved into nothing, leaving investigators with a growing sense of frustration. The forensic evidence was sent to the state lab with urgent priority, but DNA processing takes time, even with a rush order. Weeks passed with no results, then a month, then 2 months. Christmas came and went, the first holiday season where Louise and Jay's children had to navigate grief instead of gathering around their parents' table. Sarah flew in from Colorado and Michael from Florida, and they met with Detective Holland in a conference room at the police station where he walked them through everything the department had done, every lead followed, every piece of evidence collected. He promised them he wasn't giving up. He could see in their faces they wanted to believe him, but he could also see the fear starting to creep in, the terrible awareness that some cases never get solved, some killers never get caught, some families never get answers. By the spring of 2017, the investigation had slowed to a crawl. Every obvious lead had been exhausted. Every person who might have had any connection to the guys had been interviewed and cleared. The DNA results had come back showing genetic material from an unknown male at the scene, but running it through CODIS, the national DNA database, produced no matches. Whoever had killed Louise and Jay Guy either had no criminal record or had committed their crimes before DNA collection became standard practice. The case wasn't officially closed, but the daily work stopped. Holland moved on to newer homicides, cases where the trail was fresh and witnesses' memories were sharp. But he kept the Guy file on his desk, kept their picture pinned to his bulletin board, and every few months he'd pull out the evidence and review it again, looking for something he'd missed, some connection he hadn't made. The community slowly returned to normal, the way communities always do after tragedy. The newspaper articles stopped. The evening news moved on to other stories. Life continued for everyone except the people who loved Louise and Jay, who remained frozen in November of 2016, unable to move forward because how could you move forward when the person who destroyed your family was still out there, still free, still living their life while your loved ones were gone? Sarah started having panic attacks every time her phone rang, convinced it would be news that the killer had struck again. Michael threw himself into work, spending 16-hour days at the hotel because being busy meant not thinking, and not thinking was the only way he could function. The grandchildren grew older, celebrated birthdays and holidays in homes that felt emptier, where conversations were carefully steered around the topic of how Grandma Louise and Grandpa Jay died, because nobody wanted to say the word murder in front of children who were too young to understand that end of evil. 8 years. The case stayed cold for 8 years while forensic technology advanced, while investigative techniques evolved, while somewhere in Tennessee a killer walked free, perhaps believing they'd gotten away with it forever. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined as they lived their life and built whatever facade of normalcy they maintained, was that DNA evidence doesn't age the way memories do. The biological material collected from that crime scene in 2016 was waiting, preserved, and cataloged, ready for the moment when technology would finally be powerful enough to reveal its secrets, and in 2024, that moment arrived. Detective Rachel Torres, who had inherited the case when Holland retired in 2021, decided it was time to try something new, something that had recently revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. She was going to use genetic genealogy, the same technique that had caught the Golden State Killer, to find out who had murdered Louise and Jay Guy. She had no way of knowing that the answer would be so close to home, so shocking to everyone who thought they knew this community and the people in it. But she was about to find out, and nothing would ever be the same. The years between 2016 and 2024 passed with the peculiar weight that time carries after unsolved tragedy, each day feeling simultaneously endless and somehow gone before you could grasp it. For Sarah and Michael Guy, time had fractured into two distinct realities: the world before their parents were murdered and the world after, and they existed in that afterspace like ghosts haunting their own lives. Sarah would be folding laundry in her Colorado home and suddenly find herself standing motionless, a towel clutched in her hands, thinking about how her mother used to fold fitted sheets into perfect squares, a skill Sarah had never mastered, and now never would. Michael would be reviewing hotel occupancy reports in his Florida office and realize he'd been staring at the same spreadsheet for 20 minutes, his mind back in that little ranch house on Maple Ridge Drive, wondering for the 10,000th time what his parents' last moments had been like. He'd been afraid, if they'd suffered, questions that had no answers and would drive him mad if he let them. Every year on November 10th, the anniversary of the last time anyone saw Louise and Jay alive, Sarah and Michael would fly to Knoxville. They'd meet at Tuscaloosa Memorial Gardens, where their parents were buried side by side under a shared headstone that read, "Together forever, beloved parents and grandparents." They'd stand in silence mostly, sometimes crying, sometimes just numb, always wondering if this would be the year they finally got answers. Sometimes the children would come, the grandkids who remembered Grandma Louise's peach cobbler and Grandpa Jay's stories, now teenagers who carried their own grief and anger about the stolen years they should have had. Other times it was just Sarah and Michael, two middle-aged people united by loss and the terrible bond of being murder victims' children, a club nobody ever wants to join. The first few anniversaries drew small crowds. Neighbors from Maple Ridge Drive would come, people who remembered Louise from the elementary school, former customers from Jay's mechanic shop. They'd bring flowers and stand respectfully at a distance, offering condolences that all sounded the same after a while. "We're so sorry. They were such good people. We're praying for justice." Sarah appreciated the sentiment, but sometimes the platitudes felt hollow when another year had passed, with no arrests, no breaks in the case, no movement at all. By the 5th anniversary in 2021, the crowds had thinned. By the 7th, it was mostly just family. People forget, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity, because you can't carry someone else's grief forever when you have your own life to live. Sarah understood that intellectually, but it still hurt. Felt like her parents were being forgotten, like their deaths were becoming just another statistic in Knoxville's crime records. But there was one person who never forgot, who couldn't forget even if he wanted to. Detective Marcus Holland had officially retired from the Knoxville Police Department in 2021, but retirement hadn't freed him from the ghosts of unsolved cases, particularly the Guy murders. His wife, Patricia, had hoped that leaving the job would mean leaving the darkness behind, that they could finally take the trips they'd always planned, spend time with their own grandchildren without Marcus disappearing into his head, haunted by crime scene photos and unanswered questions. But she'd known her husband for 43 years, long enough to recognize that some cases become part of you, and Louise and Jay Guy had become part of Marcus Holland in a way he couldn't articulate even to himself. In his garage, Holland kept boxes of case files that he technically wasn't supposed to have, copies he'd made over the years, photographs and witness statements and forensic reports that he'd review periodically like a scholar studying ancient texts. His garage had become a shrine of sorts to unsolved mysteries, but the Guy case occupied the place of honor, spread across a folding table he'd set up against the back wall. On days when Patricia went to visit their daughter, Holland would spend hours in that garage, putting on his reading glasses and going through everything again, the timeline reconstructed on a corkboard with colored string connecting events, the witness statements with certain phrases highlighted in yellow, the forensic reports with their clinical descriptions of violence that made his chest tight even after all these years. Holland had worked hundreds of cases in his 23 years as a detective, but something about this one had burrowed under his skin and made a home there. Maybe it was the senselessness of it, the absolute lack of apparent motive. Maybe it was how much Louise and Jay reminded him of his own parents, good people who'd worked hard and been kind and deserved to grow old in peace. Or maybe it was simply the net. Maybe it was just the profound injustice of it. Two people who'd spent their lives making their community better, murdered in their own home, and nobody held accountable. Holland had always believed in justice, believed that his job meant something beyond just processing crime scenes and filing reports. He believed that catching killers mattered not just for punishment, but for cosmic balance, for the idea that evil actions have consequences and victims deserve vindication. The Guy case violated that belief system, represented a fundamental failure that he took personally, even though he knew that was neither logical nor healthy. When Detective Rachel Torres took over the case in 2021, Holland had driven to the station to meet her, bringing his boxes of unofficial files and a flash drive with digital copies of everything. Torres was young, early 30s, with a reputation as a meticulous investigator who transferred from Nashville after successfully clearing several cold cases using new forensic techniques. Holland had been skeptical at first, the way old cops always are about young detectives who think they're going to solve cases that stumped their predecessors. But sitting across from Torres in that conference room, watching her take notes and ask smart questions and actually listen instead of just waiting for him to stop talking, Holland felt something he hadn't felt in years regarding this case. He felt hope. Torres had reviewed the entire Guy file before meeting with Holland, spent weeks absorbing every detail, every interview transcript, every piece of evidence. What struck her immediately was how thorough the original investigation had been. Holland and his team hadn't missed obvious leads or made rookie mistakes. They'd done everything right by 2016 standards. The problem wasn't investigative incompetence. The problem was technological limitation. The DNA evidence collected from the scene was solid, but without a match in CODIS, it was just genetic data with nowhere to go. The case had gone cold not because anyone had failed, but because they'd reached the edge of what 2016 forensic science could do. But forensic science hadn't stayed static. Torres had been following developments in genetic genealogy ever since the Golden State Killer arrest in 2018 had demonstrated the technique's revolutionary potential. She'd attended training sessions, read case studies, networked with other investigators who'd successfully used the method to crack cold cases. The basic principle was elegant in its simplicity. Upload crime scene DNA to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch. Find distant relatives who share genetic material with your unknown suspect. Build out family trees going back generations. Then work forward to identify possible perpetrators based on age, geography, and opportunity. It was painstaking work that combined cutting-edge genetics with old-fashioned genealogical research. But it worked, solving cases that had been cold for decades. The challenge with the Guy case was the quality of the DNA sample. Genetic genealogy works best with robust, complete DNA profiles, and the sample from the Guy crime scene, while enough to run through traditional databases, was somewhat degraded. Torres consulted with forensic geneticists about whether the sample was viable for genealogical analysis. The answer was cautiously optimistic. With newer extraction and amplification techniques, they might be able to enhance the profile enough to make it useful. It would require sending the evidence to a specialized lab, and it wouldn't be cheap. The Knoxville Police Department would need to allocate significant budget to a case that was already 6 years cold with no guarantee of success. Torres made her pitch to the department brass in early 2022, armed with statistics about genetic genealogy success rates and a passionate argument about the department's obligation to Louise and Jay Guy's family. She pointed out that the Guy murders had shaken the community's sense of safety, that elderly residents still felt afraid in their own homes because a killer had never been caught. She emphasized that solving this case would demonstrate the department's commitment to justice regardless of how much time had passed. And she played her trump card, noting that the media attention from cracking a high-profile cold case using cutting-edge technology would be significant and positive at a time when police departments nationwide were facing criticism and budget cuts. The pitch worked. In March of 2022, Torres got approval to proceed with genetic genealogy analysis. The evidence was sent to Othram Labs, a company specializing in forensic-grade genome sequencing that had successfully worked numerous cold cases. The process was slow and technical, extracting DNA from the preserved samples, amplifying the genetic material using proprietary techniques, then sequencing the genome to create a profile that could be uploaded to genealogy databases. Torres checked in weekly for updates, trying not to be impatient, reminding herself that good forensic work couldn't be rushed. Finally, in July of 2022, she got the call she'd been waiting for. Othram had successfully created an enhanced DNA profile suitable for genealogical analysis. They were ready to begin the search. The profile was uploaded to GED Match and Family Tree DNA, two databases that permit law enforcement access under specific protocols. Within days, the system identified several matches, distant relatives who shared segments of DNA with the unknown perpetrator. These weren't close matches, not parents or siblings or even first cousins, but third and fourth and fifth cousins, people separated by 4 or 5 generations who shared a common ancestor born sometime in the 1800s. To most people, these would be strangers, relatives so distant you'd never meet them at a family reunion. But to a genetic genealogist, they were breadcrumbs leading back to a family tree that could be built and analyzed and ultimately used to identify a killer. Torres hired a genetic genealogy consultant named Margaret Chen, a former librarian who discovered a talent for building family trees while researching her own ancestry and had transitioned into forensic genealogy work after the Golden State Killer breakthrough. Chen was methodical and brilliant, the kind of researcher who could spend 12 hours staring at census records and property deeds and find connections that others would miss. She began the painstaking work of identifying the common ancestors shared by the DNA matches, then building out complete family trees showing all descendants. This meant diving into historical records going back to the Civil War era, tracing families through marriages and births and deaths, following surname changes and geographic migrations, assembling a massive genealogical puzzle where each piece was a human life. The work took months. Chen would send Torres periodic updates, usually dense reports with hand-drawn family trees showing multiple generations and highlighting individuals who warranted further investigation. By late 2022, Chen had identified 3 family lines that all connected back to East Tennessee in the 1800s. The challenge was narrowing down which descendants from these lines would have been the right age and in the right location to have committed the Guy murders. The initial list included over 100 male descendants who would have been between 20 and 70 in November of 2016. Many could be eliminated immediately because they died before 2016 or were living in other states with documentation proving they couldn't have been in Knoxville. But that still left dozens of viable candidates who needed to be investigated. Torres and her team began the delicate process of background checks without alerting their subjects. They pulled DMV records, employment histories, property records, anything public that would tell them where these men had been living in 2016 and whether they had any connection to Knoxville or the Guys. Most could be eliminated fairly quickly, men who'd moved away decades earlier or who had solid alibis for other reasons. But as they worked through the list through 2023, one name kept drawing Torres's attention. A man who not only lived in Knoxville in 2016 but had lived there his entire life. A man whose address in November of 2016 placed him less than 2 miles from Maple Ridge Drive. A man who had a connection, albeit a tenuous one, to Jay Guy's old mechanic shop. A man who, on paper, looked like a completely normal, upstanding citizen, but who fit the geographic and temporal parameters perfectly. Torres felt her pulse quicken as she dug deeper into this particular suspect's background. She couldn't move too fast, couldn't get ahead of herself, because circumstantial connections and family tree analysis weren't enough for an arrest warrant. She needed direct DNA evidence, a sample from this man that could be compared to the crime scene profile, and she needed to obtain it legally in a way that would hold up in court. Torres knew from other cases that the best approach was collecting abandoned DNA, items discarded in public that were legally considered trash and therefore accessible without a warrant. But that required surveillance, patience, and luck. While Torres built her case through late 2020 and early 2024, life continued for the Guy family in that strange, suspended state of unresolved grief. Sarah had stopped expecting phone calls from the police. Michael had trained himself not to Google his parents' names because the search results were always the same. Old news articles about an unsolved double homicide, speculation and dead ends and no justice. The grandchildren were growing up with a fundamental distrust of the world's fairness, having learned too young that bad things happen to good people and sometimes nobody is held accountable. They'd carry that lesson into adulthood, a weight they'd bear forever because of what someone had done to 2 elderly people on a November night 8 years ago. But Torres hadn't given up. She never gave up. It wasn't in her nature. Through January and February of 2024, she ran additional background checks on her primary suspect, looking for anything that might strengthen the case or reveal a motive. She found minor things, parking tickets and property tax records and social media profiles, but nothing that screamed guilt, nothing that would convince a judge to issue a warrant for DNA collection. She needed that discarded sample. In March of 2024, Torres initiated surveillance, assigning a rotating team to follow the suspect and wait for an opportunity. They watched him run errands, attend social functions, go about his daily life with no apparent awareness that 8 years after committing murder, justice was finally closing in. They watched and waited for him to throw away a coffee cup or a water bottle or a napkin, anything with saliva or skin cells that could yield DNA. The break came on March 15th. The suspect stopped at a local coffee shop, ordered a large coffee to go, and sat in his vehicle in the parking lot drinking it while checking his phone. When he finished, he tossed the empty cup in a trash can outside the coffee shop entrance and drove away. The surveillance team waited 10 minutes to be safe, then retrieved the cup, carefully bagging it as evidence and maintaining chain of custody. The cup was rushed to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation lab with urgent priority. Torres felt hope and dread in equal measure. This was it. Either the DNA would match and they'd have their killer, or it wouldn't and they'd be back to square one, and she didn't know if she could bear disappointing the Guy family again. The lab results came back on April 2nd, 2024. Torres was in her office when the call came, and she actually had to ask the forensic scientist to repeat himself because she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. The DNA from the coffee cup matched the DNA from the Guy crime scene. Not a familial match suggesting a relative, but a direct match. They had their killer. After 8 years, after thousands of hours of investigation, after technological advances in genetic genealogy and surveillance and patience, they finally knew who had murdered Louise and Jay Guy. Torres sat at her desk staring at the lab report, feeling the weight of 8 years compress into this single moment of certainty, and she knew that everything was about to change. For the Guy family who'd waited so long for answers, for the community that had never felt entirely safe since that November in 2016, and for the person whose name was on that lab report, whose normal life was about to end the moment Torres showed up at his door with an arrest warrant and the undeniable truth that DNA never lies and time never erases what you've done. Torres spent the days after receiving the DNA confirmation building an airtight case, assembling every piece of evidence into a prosecutable package that would leave no room for reasonable doubt. She worked with Assistant District Attorney James Rutherford, a prosecutor with 15 years of experience who specialized in cold cases and understood the unique challenges they presented. Juries were naturally skeptical of cases built on decades-old evidence, suspicious of why it had taken so long to make an arrest, concerned about faded memories and degraded physical evidence. Rutherford's job was to anticipate every defense argument and preemptively destroy it, and he approached the Guy case with the meticulous attention of someone who knew that one mistake could let a killer walk free. The suspect's name was David Wayne Morrison, and on paper he looked like the last person you'd suspect of double homicide. 58 years old in 2024, married for 32 years to his high school sweetheart Jennifer, father of 2 grown daughters, grandfather to 3 young children, he doted on with the kind of affection that seemed genuine to everyone who knew him. He'd worked for the same HVAC company for 27 years, rising from technician to regional manager, known for his reliability and his gentle manner with customers. He attended Cornerstone Baptist Church every Sunday, sang in the choir, volunteered with the church's home repair ministry that helped elderly and disabled residents with maintenance they couldn't afford. He coached youth soccer for a decade, taught dozens of kids not just about the game but about sportsmanship and perseverance. He was, by every outward measure, exactly the kind of person who made a community function, who contributed and cared and seemed genuinely invested in making the world around him better. But Torres had learned long ago that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like soccer coaches and choir members and devoted family men. Sometimes they hide behind respectability, so convincing that even people who knew them well would swear they were incapable of violence. The disconnect between who David Morrison appeared to be and what the DNA evidence proved he had done was profound and disturbing, but Torres had seen it before. The Golden State Killer had been a former cop and grandfather. BTK had been a church president. Evil doesn't announce itself with obvious signs. It camouflages itself behind normalcy and waits for opportunities that only it can see. The connection between Morrison and the guys was thin but present. In 2016, Morrison had worked as an HVAC technician, and his service record showed he'd done repair work for Jay Guy's former mechanic shop back in 2009, fixing the air conditioning system in the shop's office. It wasn't much of a connection, and there was no evidence Morrison and Jay had maintained any relationship after that single business interaction. But it meant Morrison knew who Jay was, had been in his workspace, possibly had conversations with him. It gave Morrison knowledge of Jay's existence in a way that suggested this wasn't a completely random crime. Whether the murders had been planned or opportunistic, whether Morrison had specifically targeted the guys or simply found himself with an opportunity and seized it, these were questions that might never be fully answered. But the DNA didn't lie. Whatever had happened in that house on Maple Ridge Drive in November of 2016, David Morrison had been there, and his genetic material had been left behind in a way that could only be explained by his involvement in their deaths. Torres worked with Rutherford to prepare an arrest warrant application that laid out the entire case, from the original investigation through the genetic genealogy breakthrough to the surveillance and the damning DNA match. They submitted it to Judge Patricia Caldwell on April 8th, and she signed it without hesitation. The evidence was overwhelming. On April 10th, Torres assembled her arrest team in a briefing room at the Knoxville Police Department. 6 officers plus herself, all briefed on the suspect's background and potential risks. Morrison had no history of violence beyond this crime, no weapons registered in his name, nothing suggesting he'd resist arrest. But he was a double murderer, and they'd be taking no chances. The plan was to execute the warrant early morning at Morrison's residence, a modest 2-story home in a quiet subdivision on the north side of Knoxville. They'd arrive before dawn, minimize the chance of neighbors witnessing the arrest or Morrison having time to barricade himself or destroy evidence. Torres barely slept the night before, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong, everything that had to go right. At 4:30 in the morning on April 11th, she was in her car leading a convoy of unmarked vehicles through the dark streets of Knoxville, heading toward the moment that would finally bring justice for Louise and Jay Guy. The street was silent when they arrived, houses dark except for the occasional porch light. Morrison's home looked peaceful, the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. Torres felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she approached the front door, her hand instinctively checking that her weapon was secure even though she didn't expect to need it. She knocked, 3 firm raps that echoed in the pre-dawn quiet. Lights flickered on inside. A dog barked. Footsteps approached. The door opened to reveal David Morrison in pajama pants and a faded University of Tennessee t-shirt, his gray hair disheveled from sleep, confusion, and then dawning fear crossing his face as he registered the badges and the number of officers on his front porch. Torres identified herself and informed Morrison he was under arrest for the murders of Louise and Jay Guy. She watched his face carefully, looking for the reaction. For a moment there was nothing, just blank incomprehension as if his brain couldn't process what she'd said. Then something shifted, something behind his eyes, a flicker of recognition or resignation or calculation, there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. Morrison didn't resist as Torres placed him in handcuffs. He didn't ask questions or protest his innocence or demand to know what evidence they had. He was silent, completely silent, as they led him to a patrol car while his wife Jennifer stood in the doorway in her bathrobe, her face a mask of shock and disbelief, asking what was happening, what had David done. There must be some mistake. The arrest made regional news by noon and national news by evening. The story had all the elements that capture public attention. An 8-year-old cold case solved through genetic genealogy, elderly victims murdered in their home, a suspect who seemed like an upstanding citizen revealed as a killer. CNN ran a segment. Nancy Grace devoted an episode to it. Reddit threads exploded with amateur detectives dissecting every detail. But for Torres, the media circus was background noise. Her focus was on informing the Guy family before they heard it from news reports. She called Sarah first, reaching her at her home in Colorado mid-morning. Sarah answered on the second ring, and Torres could hear the hope and dread in her voice when she realized it was the detective calling. Torres spoke carefully, clearly, telling Sarah that they'd made an arrest in her parents' case, that the suspect was in custody, that DNA evidence had definitively linked him to the crime scene. Sarah was silent for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was shaking. "Who?" she asked. "Who killed my parents?" Torres told her. David Morrison's name explained his background, his connection to Jay's old shop. Sarah said the name meant nothing to her. She'd never heard her parents mention anyone named Morrison, couldn't understand why this stranger had destroyed her family. Torres had no satisfactory answer because sometimes there is no answer that makes sense. Sometimes evil is just evil, and trying to rationalize it only leads to more pain. Michael took the news differently, his response immediate anger rather than shock. 8 years, he said, his voice tight with fury. This bastard has been free for 8 years while my parents have been in the ground. Why did it take so long? Why didn't you catch him sooner? Torres understood the anger, had expected it, knew it came from grief and frustration and the terrible awareness that no arrest could undo what had been done. She explained gently about technological limitations, about how genetic genealogy was relatively new, about how the investigation had never stopped, even when it seemed hopeless. Michael's anger eventually gave way to exhausted relief, the kind that comes when you've been holding your breath for so long you'd forgotten what normal breathing felt like. He thanked Torres, his voice breaking, said he needed to call his sister, asked when the trial would be. Morrison was arraigned the following day, appearing in court in an orange jumpsuit and shackles, no longer the respectable businessman but just another criminal defendant facing justice. The charges were read, 2 counts of first-degree murder, and Morrison entered a plea of not guilty on advice of his court-appointed attorney. Bail was denied given the severity of the charges and the fact that Morrison had lived freely for 8 years after committing the crimes, suggesting significant flight risk. He was remanded to the Blount County Jail to await trial. The pre-trial process moved slowly, as these things always do. Morrison's defense attorney, a public defender named Catherine Walsh, who the 500th reluctantly drawn the assignment, filed the expected motions challenging the admissibility of the genetic genealogy evidence. She argued that the technique was still relatively new and scientifically questionable, that the databases used weren't reliable, that allowing this evidence set a dangerous precedent for privacy rights. But Rutherford was prepared with case law from multiple jurisdictions where genetic genealogy evidence had been admitted and upheld on appeal. He brought in expert witnesses to explain the science, to demonstrate its reliability, to show that the technique was now accepted within the forensic community. Judge Caldwell heard arguments from both sides and ultimately ruled that the evidence was admissible. The DNA match was solid, the chain of custody was documented, and the defendant's genetic material at a murder scene spoke for itself. With the DNA evidence admitted, Walsh had limited options for defense. She couldn't argue Morrison hadn't been in the guy's home because his DNA proved otherwise. She couldn't claim contamination because the evidence had been properly stored and the match was definitive. Her only real strategy was to try to create reasonable doubt about intent, to argue that perhaps Morrison had been in the home for innocent reasons and someone else had committed the actual murders. But even she seemed to recognize how weak that argument was, given the nature of the crime scene and location of Morrison's DNA. In late September, facing overwhelming evidence and the likelihood of conviction at trial, Walsh approached Rutherford about a plea deal. The negotiations were tense. Morrison was willing to plead guilty in exchange for a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Rutherford flatly refused. The Guy family deserved justice, not a deal that might see their parents' killer eventually released. He countered with an offer of 2 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Morrison would die in prison, period. Walsh tried to argue for concurrent sentences, tried to negotiate for anything less than a natural life sentence, but Rutherford wouldn't budge, and neither would Sarah and Michael Guy when they were consulted. They wanted Morrison locked away forever, wanted the certainty that he would never again be free to hurt anyone. Finally, on October 15, 2024, Morrison accepted the plea. He would plead guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder in exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table. He would receive 2 consecutive life sentences without parole, meaning he would spend the rest of his natural life incarcerated. He would die behind bars, likely in his 80s if he lived that long, never again seeing the grandchildren he'd once coached in soccer, never again singing in a church choir, never again pretending to be the good man he'd convinced everyone he was. The plea hearing was scheduled for November 1st, and Sarah and Michael flew to Knoxville for it, needing to be present, needing to look David Morrison in the eye and let him see the destruction he'd caused. The courtroom was packed with media and community members and former neighbors of the guys who wanted to bear witness. Morrison was led in wearing shackles, looking smaller somehow than he had at the arraignment, diminished by the weight of his guilt finally being acknowledged. Judge Caldwell asked if he understood the charges and the consequences of his plea. Morrison said yes in a voice barely above a whisper. She asked how he pleaded to the charge of murdering Louise Guy. Guilty. How did he plead to the charge of murdering J. Guy? Guilty. The words hung in the courtroom air, simple and devastating. Rutherford then read a victim impact statement prepared by Sarah and Michael, and it was brutal in its honesty. They talked about their parents, about the kind of people Louise and Jay had been, about the hole their deaths had left, not just in their family, but in everyone who'd known them. They talked about holidays that felt empty, about grandchildren who would grow up without knowing their great-grandparents, about 8 years of not knowing why or who or whether justice would ever come. They talked about the man sitting in shackles before them, about how he'd hidden behind respectability while their parents were in the ground, about how he'd hugged his own grandchildren while Sarah and Michael's children learned to live with grief. Sarah's voice broke multiple times reading it, and Michael had to pause to compose himself. But they got through it because they owed it to their parents to speak this truth. Judge Caldwell then addressed Morrison directly, her voice hard and uncompromising. She spoke about the particular cruelty of his crimes, about the violation of trust inherent in murdering elderly people in their own home, about the 8 years he'd stolen from the Guy family by remaining free. She spoke about how he perverted the systems of community and church and family that are supposed to protect people, using his facade of respectability as cover while he carried the knowledge of what he'd done. Then she formally sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole, and Morrison was led away, back to a cell where he would spend the remaining decades of his life. And Torres felt something release in her chest that had been tight since she'd first read the Guy case file 3 years earlier. After the hearing, Torres met privately with Sarah and Michael in a conference room at the courthouse. They thanked her, thanked Holland, who'd also attended the hearing, thanked everyone who'd worked the case over 8 years. But Torres could see the complicated emotions on their faces, relief mixed with exhaustion, mixed with the awareness that justice, while important, didn't bring their parents back. Nothing would bring them back. Morrison's guilty plea didn't undo November 2016. It didn't restore the years stolen. It didn't heal the trauma, or erase the nightmares, or make the holidays feel whole again. It was simply accountability, the minimum requirement of a just society, and even that had taken 8 years to achieve. The community reaction was mixed. Some people felt vindicated, felt that the arrest and conviction proved the system worked eventually. Others felt betrayed, having known Morrison, having trusted him, struggling to reconcile the friendly HVAC technician and church volunteer with the man who'd brutally murdered an elderly couple. His family was devastated. His wife Jennifer filing for divorce within weeks of his plea. His daughters releasing a statement saying they were horrified by their father's actions and their hearts went out to the Guy family. His former co-workers and fellow church members wrestled with guilt, wondering if there had been signs they'd missed, some indicator that Morrison was capable of this. Though Torres assured them there usually aren't signs, that's what makes these cases so difficult. Monsters look like everyone else, until suddenly they don't. The investigation into motive remained incomplete. Morrison never explained why he'd killed Louise and Jay Guy. He never admitted to planning it or described how it happened or offered any insight into what had driven him to murder 2 elderly people who by all accounts had never done anything to harm him. His attorney advised him to remain silent, and he followed that advice, leaving questions that would never be answered. Torres had theories, based on the crime scene evidence and the minimal connection between Morrison and Jay, but they were just theories. Maybe it was a robbery attempt gone wrong despite nothing being taken. Maybe Morrison had some imagined grievance against Jay from their brief business interaction years earlier. Maybe it was something darker and more random, an opportunity seized by someone with violence living inside them waiting for an outlet. Without Morrison's confession, they'd never know for certain, and Torres had made peace with that. Not every question gets answered. Sometimes you have to accept that you've caught the killer and brought justice, even if the why remains forever mysterious. In the months after Morrison's sentencing, life slowly found a new rhythm for everyone affected by the case. Sarah and Michael began the difficult work of processing not just their parents' murders, but the 8 years of uncertainty that had followed. They started grief counseling, separately and together, learning to carry their loss in a way that didn't consume them. They established a scholarship in their parents' names at the elementary school where Louise had worked, funding education degrees for students who wanted to become teachers, turning their grief into something that would help children the way their mother had. They couldn't change what had happened, couldn't bring their parents back, but they could honor the kind of people Louise and Jay had been by ensuring their legacy continued. Marcus Holland felt a weight lift that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. The Guy case had haunted him through retirement, visited him in dreams, made him feel like he'd failed even though rationally he knew he'd done everything possible with the technology available in 2016. Morrison's conviction felt like vindication, proof that the investigation had been solid, that the evidence had been properly preserved, that justice had just needed time and technology to catch up with truth. He could finally set aside those boxes in his garage, could look at Louise and Jay's photograph without the gnawing guilt of an unsolved case. He and Patricia took the trip to Ireland they'd been planning for years, and for the first time in nearly a decade, Marcus was fully present, not haunted by ghosts of cases that remained open. Torres moved on to other cases, other families waiting for answers, but she kept a photo of Louise and Jay Guy on her desk, a reminder of why the work mattered, why persistence and patience and refusing to give up could eventually crack even the coldest cases. She thought about them sometimes, about how they'd spent their lives being kind and serving their community, about how that goodness hadn't protected them when evil came to their door. But she also thought about how their story had ended, not with mystery, but with justice. How David Morrison would spend the rest of his life paying for what he'd done. How genetic genealogy and dogged investigation and people who cared had finally given Louise and Jay Guy their voice back. On November 10th, 2024, the 8th anniversary of the last day anyone saw Louise and Jay alive, but the first anniversary after justice had been served, Sarah and Michael returned to Tuscaloosa Memorial Gardens. They stood beside their parents' grave under a gray Tennessee sky that threatened rain but held off. And this time, when they stood there in silence, the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. It was the silence of peace. Hard-won and imperfect, but real. They'd never stopped missing their parents, never stopped wishing for the years that had been stolen, never fully understand why David Morrison had done what he'd done. But they had answers now, and they had justice, and that was something. That was enough to finally start healing, to finally start remembering Louise and Jay, not just as murder victims, but as the people they'd been, the mother and father and grandparents who'd loved deeply and lived kindly and deserved to be remembered for how they'd lived, not just for how they died. Where are you watching from today? Leave a comment and let us know if you remember a case like this in your own community. A time when justice took years but finally arrived, proving that some truths refuse to stay buried forever, that DNA doesn't lie, and that time and technology and people who refuse to give up can eventually bring even the coldest cases back into the light.